Hi, my name is Tom Wiscombe, and I am going to introduce Dominic and Chris Leong tonight. I'm going to get started right away here, and we're going to end promptly at 8 o'clock, just so everyone knows, and we're going to adjourn to a kind of a breakout session, an internal breakout session. So welcome to this SCI-Arc public lecture. And so tonight, Dominic and Chris Leong, aka Leong Leong, they're brothers. Their office is in New York City. They both teach at Columbia. Dominic went to school at Columbia and Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo before that, and Chris went to school at Princeton and Berkeley before that. They came through offices like Shop and Schumi, and I'm really happy to have you guys here tonight. You guys have a building practice, and I think that's so important, and you work through projects. I'm really excited to see your work tonight. You guys argue for contemporary softness, interiority, sanctuary, foam, and analog materiality, all cycled through or applied to the seeming late modernism of primitive geometry, compositional, figured plans, and the hide and reveal of glass. This seems to be both a strategic maneuver in terms of sustaining a viable practice, but is more importantly a kind of sneaky undermining of the principles of a thing in order to create its opposite. The modern project poses a subject that is, as in Le Corbusier's modular, the least, or at least rhetorically, the source of its proportions and scales, but is also in a way empty of subjects. It sought to be a general type for a generalized citizen, which may not exist today and probably never existed. Modern interiorities are essentially the insides of outsides, isomorphic, with a kind of equivalence and transparency. The work of Leong Leong aims to inject a new sense of the interior inside of those architectural shells, somehow connecting it to a revised public and to its users in ways that modernist uniformity does not allow. The part I'm most interested in and hope to hear more about tonight is the way they scatter the reading of the building's exterior through anomalies and weird profiles that seem to defy the very modern aesthetic they are operating within. They built a great project up in Center City, Los Angeles, that many of you may have seen, the LA LGBT Center. I'm sure they'll show it tonight. It really creeps up on you the longer you look at it. Its exterior misdirects and surprises as much as it seems familiar. And I think that effect is maybe more important in this project than their ideas about interior, which are often played out as much more familiar courts and balconies. The exterior has 100 silhouettes staged against boxy backgrounds. As you move around it, you see a glass box perched on a neck, then a face with big anime eyes, and then a kind of iceberg shape jutting out of the facade. The framing seems to require you to get out of plane, out of human elevation, out of the Renaissance maybe, to understand what you were looking at. And then only in motion do you understand it. This is no modernism, and no classical orthographic sequence can reveal these effects to you. Mimi Zeiger wrote a really great interview of this project. Mimi, hello if you're there. The kind of journalism that I really want to see more of today. A decoding, contextualizing piece with a hint of suspicion. In it, she says that the project constitutes a new queerness. In it, she's not the overt queerness of designing spaces for gay men, but the light touch of gender fluidity, multiple readings, and a non-binary identity, fragmented, contradictory, multifaceted. I think her reading is right on target, but I'm looking forward to hearing more about the overlap between these themes and the themes we know from 1980s and 90s postmodern and then post-structuralist thought, when the very same language was being used to identify the other, otherness, and multiplicity, and to call for ambiguity and multiplicity in architectural form after modernism. There are debts owed to that time in their work, no doubt, but also a special timely contribution being made here, and one I'm super excited to see unfold here tonight. So with that, Please welcome Dominic and Chris to the stage.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate it. That was a great introduction. Thoughtful. So yeah, I'm Dominic. This is Chris. You want to say hi?
Hi. Thanks.
We're in different spaces in New York. So let's see. I'm going to share. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we're based in New York. We have a small office on Bowery. And Chris and I are brothers, as Tom said. We grew up in California. I've been in New York for a long time. And the last time we gave a lecture was 1 month into the quarantine here in New York. And it was a timely opportunity to reflect on the unfolding new normal. And that has now just become normal. So a lot has happened in the last 9 months. We've experienced the uprising for racial justice after the murder of George Floyd. Our democracy continues to struggle for some sense of legitimacy in the face of an aspirational fascist regime. And now we're staring down the second wave of COVID with the hopes of a vaccine in the horizon. And so this is a good opportunity for us to take stock again, given the kind of quickly evolving realities that we live in. And we thought it'd be great to think about some of the work we did in the past and some of the things we're thinking about in this kind of transitional period that we're all working through. So a little bit about our practice. We really think of it as kind of a hybrid between a traditional architecture firm and what we call a kind of creative consultancy, which essentially enables us to operate within the traditional framework of like the built environment, but also kind of extend into research and strategy and branding and experience. And essentially what we're really interested in is building cultural resonance and advancing social agendas in the built environment. So what does that mean? We'll try to unpack that a little bit. And I think fundamental to our understanding of our practice is thinking about architecture as both an aesthetic practice and a social practice. And that aesthetics are social, and that our kind of social activities also have aesthetic capacities which bind us together in different kind of collective experiences or collectivities. We do think that historically these what are sometimes considered like polar opposites, I think, in kind of contemporary architecture today. It is possible, I think, to find new alignments between these types of practice. And so, as Tom mentioned, ambiguity, I think we do a lot of debts to modernism, postmodernism, in terms of using ambiguity as a tool or device that works both in terms of form and organization. So the idea of the gestalt, identity flipping back and forth, we oftentimes take that very literally in terms of creating like figured forms that can translate into kind of spatialized organizations or even furniture. But we also think of ambiguity in terms of materiality and the idea that a kind of clear, legible form could be, the perception of it could be undermined by a kind of almost surrealist use of material. So soft concrete, foam that looks like rock, a kind of folded surface that almost takes on the texture of water or a plant. And Chris, we were supposed to do this like as a conversation, so it doesn't turn into a monologue. So if you want to add anything, just jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay. Boundaries is also something we've been working through, over the last 10 years in different scales. Project we were working on in Yangon within an existing building, and how the architecture can actually create a new boundary, which would then produce a kind of in-between space between the old and the new. and how that translates into a suburban house in Hancock Park, which we couldn't actually design more than 50% of it because of an HBOZ guideline. So the approach was really thinking about the lot line and the boundaries that exist within the existing footprint, and how an introduction of like a figure could start to reconfigure the inside and the outside relative to the existing lot. So what you see here is a 50% transformation of a kind of ranch-style house into kind of sanctuary, domestic sanctuary, that starts to kind of flip the inside and the outside in, the tradition of California modernism, I guess.
I think just to add, I think Tom really brought up an interesting point about thinking about projects from the inside out, and I think that's something that we've always kind of done. And so I think the boundary is something that we've always kind of identified with and as something to subvert, and thinking about the kind of, sort of liminality between of how to operate on both sides of the boundary, or to subvert a boundary in many cases.
Yeah. And the other idea we've been working through in the last few years is this idea of convergence. Maybe it's a kind of update of hybridity, but convergence is a technological term. An iPhone is a kind of good example of convergent technology. It's sort of like the sum is more than the parts. That this technology sort of brings together what were previously just separate devices or technology, phone communication, computer communication, social media, et cetera. And that kind of convergence also playing out in the kind of hybridity between the virtual and the physical. So we've recently worked on a incubator with New Inc. For mixed reality, which really was kind of a new type of a workspace that prioritized the equally the kind of capturing of mixed reality or virtual reality within physical space that could sort of transform on a daily basis. We're also interested in the kind of hybridity of structures, or the kind of convergence of different construction types. In this case, a modular house in Mount Washington that combines, poured in place concrete foundation with 4 modular prefabricated panels that form a sort of compressed update to a kind of starter home, which incorporates a kind of thermal chimney. And how this might play out at a larger scale for a new hybrid hospitality and affordable artist housing project in Asheville, North Carolina, which sits in a floodplain on a concrete podium with a CLT structure above it. And another issue that we're really thinking about is ritual and time, and how these kind of simple technologies. We were thinking about Foucault's essay, Technologies of the Self, in which the care for oneself is related to the care for others, and by extension of that, the care for the city. And so starting thinking about these typologies that can kind of produce consciousness, new levels of consciousness, like the float tank, which is kind of evolved from John C. Lilly's experiments with psychedelics. In this case, it was a part of an exhibition at the Guggenheim in Bilbao, a prototype for a solar heated float tank, or Himalayan salts, these kind of primitive tools that are sort of basic technologies that enable interaction between two people, mortar and pestle, for example, or a tiffin or a sensor. And then most recently, we did an installation with Mimi Zeiger at the Max Center called Soft Schindler, which really was thinking about the non-binary history of the house. And so we're kind of playing with this notion of the outdoor hearth becoming actually a space of fermentation for 3 vessels carved out of stone, which ultimately over the 3-month process, we fermented with two fermentation experts what became a meal or a tasting. And so the other thing we are really thinking about are how to build social agendas within the built environment. And we're going to talk about 3 projects, including the LGBT Center. And what we are thinking about is how does architecture really, how is it part of a social process, an evolution from informal collectivity that becomes spatialized, that grows and changes, and then actually creates a new typology. And in this case, these informal collectivities are historically marginalized groups, Asian Americans for Equality, the LGBT Center in Hollywood, who historically have not had opportunities to have a civic presence or to, in a way, create new types of architecture at the scale of the city. Chris.
So our office is located in Chinatown, downtown New York, about a couple blocks from this building here, Confucius Tower. I used to live right across the street here on Division Street. But the story begins here in 1974 with an organization called Asian Americans for Equality that actually formed as a civil rights activist organization, a grassroots organization in Chinatown, when they saw Confucius Tower being built and realized there was no Asian American representation in the construction of the building, in the architecture itself. And they've since grown to become one of the largest affordable housing developers in Lower Manhattan. And they have their footprint and they operate throughout the city, primarily in Flushing, downtown New York, and Sunset Park, serving a variety of groups, not just Asian American groups. They also provide social services, financial services, and many, many other things. And so we've done quite a few projects with them. This is one in Flushing, right here off of Main Street on 39th Avenue, which actually has the highest foot traffic outside of Times Square in the pre-COVID times. And this is a sort of the thoroughfare leading from downtown Flushing to the waterfront, which looks out to Willets Point. And this is a project that was to be their first sort of ground up project that served sort of multiple communities as both sort of a 4-pronged kind of space, an office space, an incubator, headquarters building, and a food hall marketplace. And one of the things that we were really interested in and working in Flushing was a kind of unique type of urbanism that exists in Flushing that you don't see typically in other parts of this city, which is this kind of very dense kind of vertical stack that happens right off of the sidewalk. So you're getting retail at a cellar level, at a half level above, and even up. So there's a kind of verticality that happens in a kind of density that you might see much more in typical, Asian cities. That was very kind of interesting and specific to Flushing. That sort of informed this project. It's called the Center for Entrepreneurship and Community. And I think one of the main things is to create a mixed-use building that wants to really activate with the street. What's a way in which we could do that? And we sort of, by stacking the building, the idea of creating this communicating stair that wove through the first 3 levels that both served as a informal gathering place and an entryway, but also kind of a front porch that would allow all the activities on the interior to be on display to anyone sort of in the community. And so the building itself, which occupies a corner site, which looks out into Willets Point area, is really a kind of a stack and a kind of interlock of these 4 volumes representing these 4 programs. And the interlocks both interlock, but then also create these outdoor spaces, these terraces, and also defining these 4 volumes. we articulated the facades with a gradient of opacity as it went further up, taller up in the building. Yeah, and so here we're looking out into it. So the idea of the building is really sort of on display. Another project we've done with Asian Americans for Equality, going back into Manhattan, is thinking about the kind of growth that's kind of occurred in the city over the past, decade. Everyone's very familiar with the High Line, which also started as a kind of grassroots kind of community public space project, but has kind of since morphed into this armature for, kind of hyper development in the city. And it begs the question of sort of who this development is for, who the city is for. And there's been a lot of criticism launched against Hudson Yards and projects around the High Line. And specifically, this is a collection of all the architects. When you think about, who represents, who designs and who designs the buildings and who these buildings are for, I think it asks a lot of questions about, what the state of kind of urbanism in the city is. And so this project, which we started in 2016, is sort of at the kind of intersection of these kind of controversies about the kind of competing needs within the city. It's for a senior affordable housing project. And the site happens to be on a community garden that's owned in the city. So two essential, elements within the city that shouldn't really be, pitted against one another, but happen to be pitted against one another in this project. So it's a very charged project. One that it's also 2 blocks away from our office. So one we're very familiar with. And we were initially kind of very, questioning whether we should be involved in a project like this, but we were actually approached by Asian Americans for Equality to propose something for this site, which was an RFQ put out by the city to create senior affordable housing, which is one of the most significant needs of housing in the city.
In a lot of ways, we thought about this project as being a potential pilot project as an alternative to the way the High Line evolved and essentially created what was supposed to be a park space into in a way a park for that doesn't necessarily serve the immediate community, but generates real estate taxes from luxury condos, et cetera.
So when Asian Americans for Equality approached us and said, we can't sort of look away when someone else will develop this project. So it's essentially within our neighborhood is something we should weigh in on. And they said, we're going to do it, but we should break the rules. And the first rule that they broke was this sort of idea of, how can we maintain this open space and how can we maintain the community garden and create equity and access on this site and still provide affordable housing. So the approach was really about, them as a developer willing to actually take the land and deed it over to a community organization to steward the land and subdivide the lot so that the entire lot wouldn't be developed, which actually opened up a really interesting kind of opportunity to think not just about the lot from the streets, from the streets, but actually to think of this kind of internal network of green space that could potentially be activated when you start thinking about opening up the property rather than sort of, maximizing its buildable area. And so here's a lot. It's between 2 streets, Amat and Elizabeth. And here you can kind of see this kind of internal network of green spaces, which are not usually publicly accessible at all. But in this case, the strategy was really
What's my clicking doing, Chris?
Yeah, we're kind of out of sync, but it's cool. Keep clicking. Yeah. So here the strategy is to really sort of take a sliver of the lot that would be a through lot connection, that would be a community garden space that would actually open up create a new muse within the block and create a south-facing facade. So the building becomes a kind of L-shaped building. This is what the as of right building would look like. And this was our proposal, which creates a south-facing facade, what actually creates a sort of a totally other condition of storefront right at the garden level. which we would then lift the building up and actually create a whole publicly accessible space that could be used year round. So you would have indoor space with the doors that could be opened. And so this idea of creating a kind of like new internal network was very intriguing, and we could do it while still achieving almost the same amount of units that you would have gotten from the as of right scheme. The building's tenants were not just AFI, who would operate a senior center space, but Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is around the corner. It was going to occupy the ground floor. And so here you kind of can see that section. The building was a single loaded corridor, passive house construction that would actually maximize this southern exposure so that seniors living there could have view of like everyone in the garden. The windows were larger, closer to the ground, and then skinnier up the top to maximize the game.
So the Los Angeles LGBT Center, this is a project that was an RFP back in 2014, RFQ, which we participated in. At the time, we thought our chances were pretty slim to win, but we thought it was an important project for a lot of different reasons. Partly also because of the understanding the evolution of LGBTQ rights movement, oftentimes is attributed to 1969 Stonewall riots, but Los Angeles actually had a pretty significant activist movement that dated back to 1959, Cooper Donuts riots or protests, and a series of kind of events that precipitated and planted the seeds for what became the current day Los Angeles LGBT Center. One of the interesting aspects of the evolution of this organization was that it was started mostly by social service workers. So from the beginning, providing social services within the context of an existing house. And from an architectural point of view, we were kind of fascinated in the use of space, the growth of the organization from kind of informal collectivity, providing social services, appropriating existing like domestic space, like a house, and the evolution of that. And there's a whole kind of history of moving from appropriation of space and into what will become a kind of civic building. So this project really represents that evolution over 50 years from the late 60s to the opening of the project in 2019. And so the center, through its evolution, kind of moved from, again, this sort of self-organized group to a institutional nonprofit, which then acquired several properties, the administrative building, the Village of Ed Gould, which is the kind of the cultural space, and then what would become the campus on Highland and McCadden and Santa Monica. And so this project really is kind of part of this longer evolution. And so we were collaborating with Killer for Flameng, the design of the project from the beginning. And the project is a client partnership between the LGBT Center and Thomas Saffron Associates, who are affordable housing developers. And the mission of the center really focusing on education, culture, and wellness programs. And what eventually became $115 million effort to get this project done. And so going back to this evolution of informal to formal, in the context of this this project, we were also looking back on it, sort of thinking about architecture in this process from going from what would be a marginalized community to an institutionalized organization, and how architecture plays a certain role within that process. Also, historically, spaces of transgression or interior spaces, and how that would evolve into an urbanism at the scale of a campus. This map essentially shows the different locations that the center has in Hollywood, and now they've expanded to Boyle Heights. But it's basically a constellation of different facilities, administrative, social services, senior housing, a youth center, health clinic called the Spot, and then the cultural program. And the site itself was 70,000 square foot site that would essentially consolidate some of these programs and increase the capacity of the center. And so from an urban point of view, it was very critical to think about how this campus design could actually activate or create a connection across the street to the village at Ed Gould. And so this was, in a way, a first opportunity for us to really think about transitioning from interiors to a kind of urban form, and how that would actually create a new urbanism within the context of this part of Hollywood. And the project is really defined by a network of needs. And early on, we were researching existing facilities, LGBT facilities, and there was an emphasis on security and discretion, understandably, for clients coming off the street. This is the youth center on Highland, which is more or less an opaque building for at-risk youth that has no windows. So we thought architecture could play a really significant role. We went to visit the Harvey Milk School here in New York, and it was really interesting learning about the design of that high school, which was intentionally designed not to look like a traditional high school in order for clients coming from normal high schools to actually be in an environment that opened up new possibilities in terms of how the space worked. The project also kind of exists at the intersection of LGBTQ homelessness and the larger housing crisis in Los Angeles, which you all are probably aware of. The program itself is pretty complex. It's more or less a city within a city. We spent over a year working with Killer for Fleming and the LGBT Center to understand the program. So the youth center, youth shelter, transitional living program, career services, senior center, senior housing, and youth housing, admin, commercial kitchen, which then became has become a training program for creating jobs in the service industry, and then the village across the street, the public plaza, and actually part of the program that we conceived of with the team was an event space, with the notion that not only meeting these essential needs, but also providing space for celebration and events and interface that would connect to the city and to the street. One of the key issues of the project was really thinking of it both as a home and a sanctuary, but also an institution and a platform. So typologically, there is some kind of contradictions in that sense. And so this issue of porosity and multiplicity, how can the building actually have a kind of multiplicity of identities, a spectrum of different users, and essentially create porosity to create safe outdoor space, and the idea that these outdoor spaces would buffer but also connect the different programs. So we went through a series of studies to kind of develop a language. We were looking a lot at the institutional scale of like mat buildings, but recognizing that they sort of lacked figuration or identity or kind of multiplicity of identities. So we're really exploring how to evolve the mat building, as well as thinking about context and how this building would have a certain degree of porosity to the context while kind of maintaining necessary safety and security. The biggest move in the project, which is the most invisible one, is actually submerging the parking to avoid a podium parking scheme, which would create an isolated kind of urban interior space. And so we proposed submerging the parking, which more or less set up the whole project to create this kind of porous interface with the existing neighborhood. So some early studies of developing this language of kind of flipping back the figure and field, the solid and void, the indoor and the outdoor spaces, and thinking about how the outdoor spaces would actually start to create the atmospheres for the interior. And so we just like built this big model, kind of shipped it out and did the presentation. These are just some early studies of thinking about how, thinking about the building from the inside out. And so you can sort of see this evolution of the mat building taking on certain kind of like spatial figures. And so through the evolution of the program, it actually became pretty dense. And the building got thicker and taller, which, actually was quite challenging in terms of maintaining that porosity. But here you can sort of see how these puzzle pieces of programs start to fit together to create a kind of larger mosaic of a kind of horizontal organization. And so this kind of horizontal organization is punctuated by with these larger volumes on top, which create this kind of urban form that has no singular identity. There's over 6 different entrances. So we're really thinking about how the building form could be both kind of single story to kind of create a more domestic scale entrances for like the youth center, creating outdoor space, which is really important for a lot of the houseless youth living on the street don't have access to safe outdoor space. So we were really thinking about how these courtyards could provide that. And then the other urban move is really about creating this plaza that would link back across to the courtyard of the village of Ed Gould and create a kind of new pedestrian-oriented kind of urban room. And then the kind of 2 and 3 story volumes on top, which create that urban form. And so the other device that we were using to sort of activate the project at the scale of both the car but also the pedestrian are these anamorphic projections, which creates circles. If you stand in 3 different locations, they sort of cut out of the frit pattern to create a transparency through the facade. And so you can kind of see how you move along the building. It changes scales. It goes up, it goes down. So there's a sort of syncopation of building forms that starts to create a layering. And we're really interested in breaking down the kind of solidity, the monolithic size of the building. So it seemed approachable from the street. And the openings in the building are very specific along the street edge to provide privacy. This is the youth center entrance. So the building opens up and closes down in very specific ways in order to be both inviting but also safe and secure. And so you can see down into the courtyard of the youth center to the right. And just a glimpse of the courtyards that are kind of slowly growing in and creating this kind of like lush interior. And this is sort of the heart of the project, which is the Pride Hall, which functions as an event space, but also has a cultural exhibition space, a rooftop terrace, and more or less bleeds into the plaza just adjacent to it and opens up onto the senior center. And currently under construction are the 100 units of senior housing, and the youth, the transitional living program across the street on McCadden. And the star-studded opening last April of 2019. So just to wrap up, Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, it's good.
Okay. Yeah, to wrap up, we wanted to kind of share some thoughts on how we think about our current realities sort of affecting the way we're thinking about what we're doing in architecture. So I'm just going to read something quickly. So in the context of our profession and discipline, we're asking the same questions many of you might be. What is the current reckoning with social justice, ecological justice? What does it mean for architecture? Architecture as a profession has always been willing or unwillingly entangled with capital, power, and the politics of oppression. Architecture recently found itself in the spotlight of the last presidential debate. If you remember Donald Trump's distorted remarks about the shrinking windows of the Green New Deal's energy plan, over the last 4 years, the political saga has played out with architecture as its protagonist in the form of walls, streets, or even cages. And while we look around to our responsibilities for shaping and caring for the environment, both built and unbuilt, we're also looking inward to ourselves in the community of architecture with its capital A that has historically found refuge in the institutional spaces of the academy and other cultural institutions. What is now unavoidably clear is that this culture of contemporary architecture that spans both the discipline and the profession is equally entangled, if not complicit, with capital, power, and the politics of oppression. If you take a look at the racial, class, gender representation in architecture, it is far from progressive, if not downright conservative. More frequently than we'd like to admit, we found ourselves in conversations on these topics when we hear a polite aversion to what is framed as, quote, this new discourse of identity politics, implying that our discipline and profession, mostly white and male, didn't already traffic in the politics of identity. We say this as mixed race, cis men who have benefited from all of it, the model minority myth, the white privilege, the heteropatriarchy. Like many of our colleagues, we're reflecting on how we got here and where here is, in fact. Now seems to be the time to reevaluate the hierarchies, the figures, the behaviors, and the North Stars that we have used to orient ourselves not only to the present and the future, but to our own imaginations and relationships to each other. What this calls for is a kind of disciplinary ego death. The best way for us to engage and understand justice is to listen and support those who have actively engaged in a process of liberation. If engaging in justice is both an act of listening and a call to action, then justice is more of a practice than a place we arrive at. Justice is more of a verb than a noun. How can we support those who are illuminating a path to liberation? We can start by acknowledging those people who have been subject to injustice and those people who have been working towards justice before us. We thank the students who have challenged the schools and our profession to make urgent changes. So we're asking ourselves these questions: who benefits from our actions as architects? Who is harmed? What can we do to minimize this harm and redistribute the benefits? Who has been silenced, erased, excluded, or oppressed by the systems we participate in and we continue to benefit from? How can we decolonize our own minds so that we don't privilege Eurocentric ways of knowing that have simultaneously extracted knowledge from other cultures while naming them as inferior? How do we become attuned to this in casual conversations, on reviews, in desk crits, in our curriculum, which creates our common culture? How do we use our privilege to make space for others and use our platforms to amplify voices that have historically been excluded? And when we think of Audre Lorde's famous words, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, we're reminded that justice is not only an act of resistance and accountability, but an act of imagination to design different tools to make different architectures. This semester, we're co-teaching a studio at GSAP with Native Hawaiian architect and artist Sean Connolly. Part of this studio has involved a deep dive into Indigenous Hawaiian culture and the ways of knowing. As the most remote landmass on the planet, transoceanic voyaging was made possible only through extensive knowledge of navigation. The Hawaiian proverb, "Ikawa mau ikawa mahope," translates to, quote, "in the time in front, in the time in back." One way to understand this proverb is to imagine you are embarking on a voyage in which your path forward into the future can only be navigated relative to the island that is now behind you in your past. So what should we take with us on this voyage, and what should we leave behind? What new histories need to be written, voices heard, and conversations had to make a new horizon for the future? Thanks.